Hi, my name is Mary Jane McCallum, and I'm here to introduce the second lecture in a special series about the history of Indigenous education. The series is sponsored by the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous People, History and Archives, and is hosted by the Winter 2025 class of University of Winnipeg students in 2616, History of Indigenous Education, Residential Schools and Beyond. It's facilitated by Studio 1L10 and by Catherine Boschman. So in this series, invited guests come and they do a formal lecture for between 20 and 45 minutes. And at that point, we'll excuse those who are joining us from Zoom, and we'll then turn to our class discussion between just the students and the invited speaker. So our guest today is Dr. Sean Carleton. Sean Carleton is an associate professor in history and Indigenous studies at the University of Manitoba. He and co-author Ellen Gabriel very recently released a book about Ellen Gabriel's life and work as an Indigenous land defender and human rights activist, and it's called When Pine Needles Fall. And so that was released late in 2024, but he's also written a book called Lessons in Legitimacy that looks at curriculum in public schools in British Columbia between 1849 and 1930. And he argues that schooling in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous classes in schools was really there to teach children and youth about values of settler capitalism. Sean's other work has been to expose, document, and confront residential school denialism in Canada, or to really question the twisting of facts that shake public confidence in truth and reconciliation efforts, ideas that defend perpetrators of violence, and ideas that protect the Canadian status quo as it is right now. So this is the work that's going to be the subject of his talk today, which is entitled Truth Before Reconciliation, Confronting Residential School Denialism. So I'll turn it over to Sean now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. McCallum, for the introduction, an invitation to speak with all of you this afternoon. It's really nice to see you and be part of this wonderful speaker series. In particular, as I see, there's lots of folks online as well, that a course on Indigenous education is also playing a public-facing role in helping bring people into truth. And this is somewhat related to what I'm going to be speaking about today, why the truth is so important. Not just establishing it, but also challenging people who want to undermine it. So it's great to be here today connecting with you folks. Looking forward to our discussion afterwards. And thanks to everyone that's tuned in online as well. So what I want to do today is talk more about some of my new research that's trying to grapple with and confront the growing phenomenon and concerning phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada, focusing specifically on the case of former Senator Lynn Beyak, and what it can teach us about how to identify and confront denialism more broadly. And then I'll make some connections to some more contemporary examples towards the end. So let's start, though, with Beyak as a way into our conversation and understanding what denialism is, what it looks like. Now, Beyak, as perhaps the most notable person spreading denialism, has made a lot of news in recent years. She illegally donated to Donald Trump's first failed election campaign. She sat maskless in the Senate at the height of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then in January 2021, she announced her early retirement from the Red Chamber, or Canada's Senate, mostly because the Senate was thanks to the work of Indigenous Senator Mary Jane McCallum, also from Manitoba, creating lots of confusion. going to hold a vote to expel her. And if expelled from the Senate, she would not be entitled to her full pension. Denialists desperately want a platform to spread their ideas, as I'll show, but they don't like facing consequences of any kind. There is, in short, a lot to the Beyak saga, and I won't have time to cover all the twists and turns today. Instead, my work looks specifically at Beyak's 2017 controversial speech in the Senate and the 100 support letters that she received and then posted to her Senate website, refused to remove for years, which is really at the heart of the Beyak story, and I think reveals a lot about how denialism proliferates. So my talk is going to historicize and contextualize residential school denialism to give us a frame, and then I'm going to use that frame to critically examine Beyak's public comments and her support letters to show how they embrace and promote residential school denialism as part of an attack on truth and reconciliation. And how all of this, I think, can teach us important lessons about how to identify and confront the growing phenomenon of residential school denialism. All right, to begin. In March 2017, Lynn Beyak, a conservative senator and member of this standing Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples, delivered a speech defending Canada's Indian residential school system as, quote, being well-intentioned. Beyak briefly admitted that, quote, mistakes were made, but she spent the majority of her speech insisting that an emphasis on the system's positives will, quote, help Canada's Native people to thrive as victors, not victims. Beyak's speech, made only a year after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, showed Canadians the evidence of how residential schooling constituted genocide, sparked, obviously, a public controversy. The senator's attempts to put a positive spin on what even Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister who appointed Beyak to the Senate, called a sad chapter in Canada's history in his apology, was not appreciated by many, including her fellow senator and the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray Sinclair, who, when initially asked about Beyak's comments, said that she and other residential school denialists were, quote, dim-witted. Even the Anglican Church, which ran a third of the schools across the country, including the Pelican Lake Residential School near Dryden, Ontario, where Beyak still lives, weighed into the debate to clarify that, in fact, nothing good came from the system. The church, like the TRC, noted that while a small minority of survivors speak of positive school experiences on a personal level, those experiences must be understood as occurring in the wider context of a genocidal school system designed to kill the Indian in the child. Despite facing widespread criticism, Beyak refused to apologize for her comments. Instead, the senator stood behind her positive perspective, even attacking criticism of her speech as fake news and exaggeration. Beyak doubled down on her defense of residential schooling, arguing, quote, there are shining examples from sea to sea of people who owe their lives to the schools. When pressed on how Indigenous people, especially the many former students who were physically and sexually abused in the schools, might feel, Beyak elaborated, quote, I've suffered with them. I appreciate their suffering more than they'll ever know, but the best way to move forward is not to blame, not to point fingers, not to live in the past. You know you've really stepped in it when the Beaverton, which is a satirical news site, kind of like The Onion in the US, right, has a good laugh at your expense, saying, Senator Beyak demands residential school survivors apologize for her suffering. But seriously, when she was confronted by reporters after making her speech and asked directly if she'd even read the Truth and Reconciliation report to better understand the history and ongoing legacy of the schools, Beyak simply stated, and this is the important part, I don't need any more education. As a result of her comments, Beyak was removed from the Senate Committee on Indigenous Issues in 2017 and she was later kicked out of the Conservative caucus. But she retained her Senate seat for another 4 years and used her platform as a senator and position to popularize residential school denialism, which, to be very clear right from the beginning, is not the denial that the system existed, or even that the system may have had some negative effects, but rather, by definition, denialism is the rejection or the attempt to twist, downplay, minimize, discredit basic facts rooted in well-documented evidence in favor of a more controversial position. And in this way, residential school denialism is similar to other kinds of denialism that we are seeing proliferate in our age of mis and disinformation. Things like climate change denialism, right? Or science or vaccine denialism. Denialism in general is a strategy used to try and shake public confidence in something. And in this case, it is about truth and reconciliation. And I'll explain why in a moment. Now, while not wanting former students of residential schools to dwell on their victimization at the hands of church and state officials, in the aftermath of her 2017 comments, Beyak quickly constructed herself as a victim of politically motivated attacks on free speech. Rather than reflection, Beyak dug in and fortified her position by using her Senate website here, which you can see on the screen, to post not only her full text of the speech, but also further personal statements and a selection of letters that she received here on her website supporting her comments. Now, it's tempting to stereotype those who engage in residential school denialism as ignorant bigots, or to simply ignore them, so as to deny them the recognition they seek for themselves and their ideas. Silence, some say, starves denialists of their sustenance, which is dialogue, right, to platform their ideas further. Alternatively, and we can talk about this in the questions, some want to turn to authority, institutions like universities, the police, or even the state to shut down talks, criminalize denialism. But often, this tends to give denialists what they want most, which is a platform to spread their ideas further. So we can think about that as we go along. How do we stop this? Murray Sinclair, however, suggests a different approach that I try and amplify and build on in my work. And I want to emphasize this afternoon and invite you folks to consider. So Sinclair argues that it is not enough for us to simply yell at deniers and knock them down. Instead, we need to try to understand their reasoning and show how they are wrong. He elaborates saying, quote, "I've always been convinced that while we may not deal with all of the denialists, we can at least take away their tools. By challenging the comments of high-profile people like Beyak and others, Sinclair is hopeful that denialists will have a diminishing population of people who will believe them. They'll be the new flat earthers, the people that deny gravity. They can do it, but nobody really believes them, right?" So Sinclair, in short, advocates a strategy of engagement to contain, disprove, and discredit denialists. Taking away the tools of residential school denialists requires a better understanding of those tools and how and why people employ and defend them. And in that spirit, my work documents and interrogates the Beyak controversy as a way of comprehending and confronting not just Beyak, but the phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada generally. So that's what we're going to do this afternoon. As Dr. McCallum noted, my training is in history as a historian, so I, by obligation, have to start with some history. And emphasize from the beginning that residential school denialism is not actually a new phenomenon. indeed downplaying or minimizing the destructive effects of residential schooling for Indigenous children has a long history in Canada, going back to the origins of the system in the 1870s and 1880s at least. For much of the system's history, church and state officials likened the schools to a humanitarian, even sacred, or in the Christian sense, divine enterprise designed to save Indigenous communities from extinction in the face of a so-called higher form of civilization. That was the racist rhetoric that was used to justify not only the creation of the system, but its maintenance for over 100 years. Even when faced with irrefutable evidence of poor instruction and horrific conditions, much of which I'm sure you're learning in this course, officials mostly clung to that humanitarian discourse and discredited the system's detractors, including some Indigenous parents and students, of course, and I know you're reading some of that for this week, but also non-Indigenous experts as well. In the early 1900s, as the system was still getting started, Dr. Peter Bryce, as an example, published a report for the Department of Indian Affairs, which he was asked to create, slamming residential schools for their abnormally high rate of student death and disease that he suggested was exacerbated by overcrowding, poor nutrition, lack of proper sanitation. His report, as my research collaborator, Katie McKenzie, and I have written about, was actually leaked to the press. It was debated in the House of Commons. It was actually leaked to the press and covered in newspapers across the country, from Ottawa to Vancouver Island. In fact, at the bottom right-hand screen here is a headline from the Times Colonist on Vancouver Island that said of the report, "Indian schools deal out death. Startling rate of mortality is shown in report to the department. 25% mortality." Dr. Bryce shows that conditions are such as to encourage disease. Instead of rectifying the system's obvious problems as the system was getting up and running, the department buried Bryce's report. As a medical expert, Bryce tried to blow the whistle on the system in its initial phase. After he is pushed out of the civil service by Duncan Campbell Scott, he goes on to publish not only his report, but also his correspondence showing the kind of structures of indifference that were fundamental to the way that the Department of Indian Affairs was being managed. And he called this the story of a national crime in 1922. But officials, much like Beyak, chose to selectively focus on the positives of the system, or more correctly, that they hoped that the system would have. And the system was allowed to continue to the mid-1990s. In fact, the residential school system peaks in the 1950s after the Department of Indian Affairs knows everything that Bryce tried to blow the whistle on early on. Kind of challenges our idea that nobody knew, or that, like this same headline in 2021 would have shocked Canadians. And yet many Canadians read it in 1907. And we actually see residential schooling increase after that. So it challenges our kind of comfortable narratives that we didn't know, and then now we know and we're doing something about it. It's not until former students began publishing accounts of their abuse in schools and organizing for redress in the 1980s that the humanitarian discourse about residential schools starts to shift significantly in the mainstream. As more students spoke out about their experiences, publishing memoirs, etc., they emboldened others to come forward, eventually sparking a movement led by former students to collectively seek compensation for their time spent in institutions. And with many church and state officials still denying any wrongdoing in the 1980s and 1990s, or trying to limit litigation, students forced the issue by launching, at the time, the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. I think it's the second largest now. which the government chose to settle out of court by agreeing to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006-2007. Sometimes, there's a misconception that church and state realized how bad the system was, and out of the goodness of their heart, they decided to apologize and commit to the TRC. No, they were forced into that by survivors. And they chose to settle out of court because they wanted to limit how much they were going to pay. But importantly, this class action lawsuit settlement puts in motion things like the government apology in 2008, and then in the same month of that apology, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gets started, which was actually part of the remedy of this class action lawsuit. And the TRC published its final report in 2015, and the conclusions shocked many Canadians, but of course confirmed what generations of Indigenous people and historians already well understood. But this commission made it clear that shaming and pointing out wrongdoing was not actually the TRC's mandate, or even what the TRC's report should do. Instead, they say the focus on truth determination was intended to lay the foundation for the important question of reconciliation. Their argument was, we need to speak the truth and understand the truth of the system before we can have reconciliation. So the goal was actually to educate us, to teach us about the truth of residential schooling. Now, many Canadians have embraced the challenge put forward by the TRC and are, in differing ways, engaged in reckoning with Canada's colonial past to create a better future. Others, however, are choosing to dispute, deny, and discredit the Commission's findings as an excuse to avoid participating in the hard work of reconciliation. They're looking for an easy way out. You don't have to deal with a history that you downplay or minimize. To be sure, grappling with matters of genocide is not easy. Challenges some of the core myths about Canada that many of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, learn in elementary and high school, right? But it is the task that Indigenous and, in particular, non-Indigenous people living in what is currently Canada are being asked to do in the era of truth and reconciliation. Relearn our history, see things from different perspectives, challenge our relationship to Indigenous peoples and these lands, figure out a way to build a better future. That requires a grappling with the truth of things like colonialism and its connections to residential schools. And so part of my argument is that actually scholarly literature in the field of genocide studies can help us in the work that we need to do. By showing how different countries around the world are dealing with the legacies of different kinds of genocide and addressing the phenomenon of denialism in particular. In fact, denialism is not an aberration. It's something to be expected in the context of genocide. Many genocide scholars will point out that denialism is the final stage of a genocide, something to be expected, actually. Political scientist Adam Jones argues that the manipulation of memory and history often occurs in the aftermath of genocides. In looking at Germany's grappling with the Jewish Holocaust as an example, he shows how a willful amnesia and politicized forgetting emerged in the immediate post-war period in Germany as a way to distance the country and its citizens from its very recent Nazi past and its ongoing effects. In reflecting on the psychology of denialism, Jones argues that individual and collective narcissism play a pivotal role in buttressing denialism. In many contexts, the denialist stance heads off a cognitive dissonance between one's preferred view of self and country and the grimmer reality. In Canada, we have the myth. Canada's a peaceful, tolerant, benevolent, multicultural country. And a lot of people have a hard time understanding the Indigenous reality that there's an ongoing genocide, right? So that cognitive dissonance between Canada the good and the reality for many Indigenous people. And in this way, genocide studies and its insights overlap with lessons from recent Indigenous studies literature on the role of colonial denial in Canada. And scholars such as Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt illustrate how Canadians like to imagine that they've always acted with peaceful and good intentions. Canadians do not like to hear that their country was founded through frauds, abuses, and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people. Instead of confronting this reality, Canadians, they argue, seek refuge in myths of benevolence and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that justify colonial policy as being well-intentioned, even necessary and enlightened. Instead of seeing reconciliation as an opportunity to change their relationship to these lands and the original peoples here, scholars such as Lee Maracle argue that Canadians, quote, tend toward defensiveness. Properly contextualized, right, rather than thinking about denialism as just mean things racists say on the internet, I argue that denialism can be understood as a powerful tool that some choose to use to protect the status quo in colonial settings, including in Canada. Rather than unsettle the history of Canada and confront the ongoing legacy of colonization and policies such as residential schools, some Canadians, like Beyak, are employing a denialist discourse that justifies their existence, their home on native land, through a combination of degrading Indigenous peoples and clinging to selective and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that they think absolves them of any wrongdoing and justifies their lack of support for reconciliation. So I think this frame helps us understand resistance to residential school truths, but also resistance to things like name changes and new commemorations. It's not about the issues at hand often. It's always at root about the preservation of self, of state, of faith, in defensive ways that I think the truth unsettles and makes people uncomfortable. Okay, back to Beyak, keeping my eye on our time. So Senator Beyak's controversial comments in the Senate in 2017 defending residential schools and the kinds of comments that they produced need to be understood in this frame as a strategy, as a tool for denying the injustices of the past and present to safeguard colonial power and privilege in the unsettling time of truth and reconciliation. That's how I think we can understand this. And I don't have time to fully get into Beyak's speech, but just a couple of quick points. And then I want to move on to her support letters, which is really the focus of my analysis. So Beyak's speech promoted a whole host of ignorant and incorrect views about Indigenous people, including her belief that, on balance, residential schooling should be considered beneficial for Indigenous people. In her speech, Beyak used what is known as false balance, a form of bias that suggests an issue is more balanced than it actually is. And what she does is she says that the good and the bad of residential schools really needs to be understood as part of the whole story. Beyak explains that people tend to only focus on the bad for political reasons, and it was her job to stick up for, quote, the other side. The problem with Beyak's premise is that it is not supported by evidence or the weight of historical scholarship. Beyak's equal weighting of good and bad reveals her fundamental misunderstanding of the historical consensus, that the problems of the Indian residential school system were systemic. That the problem with residential schooling was not only individual cases of abuse and neglect, but that for over 100 years, the government colluded with churches to devise, deploy, and defend a genocidal system that removed children from their families, often by force, to undercut and attack Indigenous lifeways to support colonization and Canadian nation building. Whether former students recall positive experiences, or whether employees believed in their benevolent intentions or not, doesn't change the genocidal effects of the system. Now, despite the inaccuracy of many of our comments in the Red Chamber, Beyak nevertheless received a lot of support. On the 6th of April in 2017, a month after making her speech, she used her Senate website to release a statement further defending her position and thanking everybody. She claimed that her supporters represent, quote, the silent majority. You know where this is going. And she wanted to write to encourage their support. She says, "You are not alone. You are the majority, as has been shown to me with all of the support I have received." Though declaring that the majority of Canadians supported her position based on a, quote, avalanche of support, the senator was cagey when pressed on evidence for that support. Beyak claimed to have received 700 letters that overwhelmingly supported her views. This, however, does not reflect reality. We know this because the Senate ethics officer launched an investigation into her use of her publicly paid for website and revealed that the senator, in fact, received a total of 6,766 letters. Of that total, only 2,389 supported Beyak's speech in the Senate, while 4,282, the vast majority, were critical of her speech. Though promising to make all of the letters publicly available, Beyak only published a handful of the letters on her website, 129 in total, and all of them in support of her comments. Though she deleted all of the letters in 2019, I downloaded them all before she did, I think these need more critical analysis, especially because the 100 letters dated between the 8th of March and the 11th of April 2017, in the month after Beyak's speech, openly engage in residential school denialism and show how mis- and disinformation can spread quite quickly, grow, and become more of a problem. Oh, sorry, I had some of that up here. But let's turn to her letters and then move into the more contemporary examples to set us up for our discussion. So I just want to give you a few samples and show how I've clustered these into three broad categories that we might think of when we think of how denialism proliferates, how we can identify it. So the three categories are personal knowledge, ignorance and anti-Indigenous racism, and something I'm calling worldviews in collision, or those that are deliberately promoting assimilation. So let's start with perhaps the most easy to understand, the personal. So many of Beyak's support letters defend residential schools based on various kinds of personal knowledge or personal information. Some authors admit to having direct experience working in the system, and it is clear that they are seeking refuge in Beyak's comments as a kind of absolution of wrongdoing for themselves or even for family members. In fact, the very first letter that Beyak publishes on her website to defend herself is from Richard here, who writes on behalf of himself and his partner, who have a, quote, combined experience of 26 years in Aboriginal and Métis schools, and thus witnessed firsthand the positive anecdotes and experience of those who gained from their attendance at residential schools. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Richard is not the only person who worked in these schools that is writing to thank Beyak for talking about the well-intentioned nature of this. So I think that's pretty easy to understand, that there are a lot of people who have skin in the game, that are, either government workers or folks that actually worked in these institutions. Okay, the second is something I'm calling ignorance and anti-Indigenous racism. And these are folks that wrote to Beyak simply because they thought her speech gave them space to voice their ignorant views about Indigenous peoples and openly perpetuate anti-Indigenous racism, which we all know. We live in a country where our national broadcaster, right, has turned off comments about Indigenous people on their stories because the racism is just totally out of control. And these writers remain unconvinced that they should care about Indigenous people, and as a result, they generally accept, buy into, and even propagate racist stereotypes that demean, diminish, and dehumanize Indigenous people, and deny any responsibility for colonization, and by extension, reconciliation. And the worst of these letters have gotten a lot of public attention, so I'm not going to give the most racist ones more of a platform here. I've written an article based on this talk that goes into some of that, but I will give you a sense of some of the ignorance on display. So in terms of ignorant views, Beyak's support letters, like Beyak's original speech, are full of incorrect assumptions rooted in misinformation. Kevin writes, your remarks to the effect that teachers and leaders involved in the program were by and large well-intentioned are obviously true. It's too bad you were under attack for speaking truthfully. Now, the evidence presented by the TRC reveals that such an assumption is in fact not obviously true. Similarly, C wrote to support Beyak and explains, I feel the current dialogue, re this part of our history, is grotesquely unbalanced. You are right to mention that it was neither the residential school employees or government intention to be cruel or wipe out an entire race. Again, here we see that aspect of false balance on display. And the TRC report and the weight of scholarly research, including my own and Dr. McCallum's, shows that while not all employees were cruel, many were. And the government's clear intention from the beginning was to kill the Indian in the child and bring about an end to Indigenous lifeways through coerced assimilation to support Canadian nation building. Though many of the support letters Beyak received used personal knowledge or racist and ignorant views to downplay the negative effects of the system, others simply doubled down on the need for assimilation, to force Indigenous people to participate in Canadian society. And this aspect of the letters, and denialism generally, has received less attention, but I think needs to be directly confronted. In many ways, it's as dangerous as the others. So many of these authors cannot or are unwilling to comprehend that Indigenous peoples have their own cultures, languages, spiritualities, and economic practices that the residential schools deliberately and systematically sought to eliminate, eradicate, and replace. Simply put, many letter writers in this next category lament the closure of the schools because they still believe in the value of coerced assimilation as a beneficent project of civilizing Indigenous people. We think this is outdated thinking. These letters show us maybe not so much. So Linda wrote to Beyak, like you, I believe the institution of residential schooling was well-intentioned and was an attempt to solve the Indian problem by integrating the children into the new way of life in order that they could function better with language, health, and skills, as if Indigenous people didn't have language, health, and skills before. What kind of language, health, and skills is the question. Similarly, Terry, in a letter that draws on all of the categories here, argues, certainly the decision to assimilate First Nations into Canada was and remains the correct one. B takes it further, suggesting I think residential schools were a noble and honest attempt to treat Natives as equals and integrate the community into the new, productive, rewarding Canadian life. Roy personified the unquestioned acceptance of assimilation by defending residential schools in the most self-centered, ethnocentric way possible. When I read this letter, I was just flabbergasted. He says, the fact is there are two good things that came out of residential schools. One, when I see an Aboriginal person, I can talk to him or her. And two, they can operate in our modern world. That's the positive. Then the author concluded, in perhaps a good way to sum all of this up, he says, quote, please hang in there and do not let the fools who think they can implement all of the recommendations of the TRC. It would destroy our nation. Okay, so that's just a sampling of the kinds of denialism that were produced as a result of Beyak's speech and her use of her Senate website, just as an example. And I'm going to conclude now by thinking about, okay, Senator Beyak retires from the Senate. So the denialism that she, helped create a platform for surely must be, receding. And in fact, that's not the case. Although Beyak has retired, the residential school denialism that she helped popularize fact, remains a key barrier to reconciliation, as Murray Sinclair recently pointed out before he passed away just recently. Indeed, Beyak's comments defending residential schooling and trying to undermine the public confidence in the TRC's report and survivor truth are but one example of the growing phenomenon of denialism in Canada. And here I'll just give you some samples and be very quick to wrap up, so we got lots of time to talk. Okay, so very quickly, how are we seeing denialism proliferate in our society today? So the first example on the top left is from Abbotsford, BC, where a teacher signed a homework assignment where students were instructed to search for online articles outlining only the positive experiences of residential schooling and providing a number of misleading, even denialist articles to get them started. In the top right, we have a former Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, who was actually caught on camera coaching young Conservatives at Toronto Metropolitan University on how to score political points by engaging in residential school denialism, essentially downplay the conservative origins of the system, and people like John A. Macdonald shift the balance to Liberals, right? Rather than understanding, the historical consensus that this was a bipartisan project. More unfortunately, we've seen a lot of academics, many of them fired and retired, engaging in despicable denialism, denigrating Indigenous communities, searching the former sites of residential schools for potential unmarked graves, suggesting it's all just fake news, a hoax. Mostly on far-right websites for money, like True North, Western Standard, Rebel News, pseudo-history journals like the Dorchester Review, etc., monetizing misinformation, right? Dressed up as truth-telling, trying to allure people to resist reconciliation. Cherry-picking particular issues, trying to distract people, right? Shake public confidence in truth and reconciliation to protect the colonial status quo. That's what these folks are up to. It's all pretty disgusting, following the same old right-wing playbook in the United States, basically to the letter. They have a new self-published book collecting a lot of articles I've already debunked that they're hawking on Amazon. That's a loophole in the Amazon publishing world. Like, you can create a book on denying gravity and sell it on Amazon. And if you've got a built-in network, you can make a lot of money by doing it. That's what these folks are up to. But it can jump from the extreme right-wing corners of the web to the mainstream political arena, which is where things can get really concerning. And I've only got 2 minutes. So some examples. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith spread the mass grave hoax narrative, which is a right-wing conspiracy theory, on her for-profit social media platform. Current Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who famously skipped out on the 2008 apology for residential schools to talk smack about Indigenous people on a Montreal talk radio show. He was recently in Winnipeg giving a talk for the Frontier Centre, a fundraising dinner. Frontier Centre is a far-right think tank that has done much to spread residential school denialism, creating books, famously taking out radio ads in 2018, questioning the truth about residential schools in the prairies. In the BC election, we had a number of people promoting residential school denialism and actually get elected, even after the controversy. And then in the bottom right here is a more heartbreaking and serious issue brought to light by my colleague at the U of M, Negon Sinclair, who has talked about the recent serial killer in Manitoba, Jeremy Skibicki, right, who targeted Indigenous women, murdering them. And at the time of his murders, the only anti-Indigenous racism that he was spreading on his Facebook, which I screen grabbed before the police shut it down, was actually residential school denialism. So, in conclusion, denialists are not simply just dim-witted. They are afraid reconciliation will unsettle their material interests and position of power in colonial society, personally or politically. They see truth and reconciliation not as the opportunity that it is, but rather as a threat. Residential school denialists are choosing to seek refuge in an assemblage of misinformation and untruths. But my argument is that this is a false refuge. Denying the colonial past and present prevents settlers, like myself, from being part of the project of reconciliation and the efforts to build sustainable and reciprocal relations with Indigenous peoples that could actually resolve some of those feelings of uncomfortableness and help us all live in these lands in better ways. Thus, contrary to Beyak's response when pressed by a reporter about her defense of residential schooling, right, that she didn't need more education, it's clear from, I hope, my talk and this class overall, that what is needed in our era of truth and reconciliation is more, not less, education about the ongoing effects of Canadian colonization and the opportunities for all of us in deep, unsettling, and meaningful reconciliation. In fact, Murray Sinclair always said that education is what got us into this mess, and education is what's needed to get us out. And that includes not only learning the truth about residential schools and other adjacent systems like day schools, tuberculosis, hospital sanitarium, child welfare, but also how to identify how people are twisting those histories and truths to try and attack reconciliation and prevent us from moving forward and building better relations. So, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sean. So now we're going to say goodbye to the people who are joining us on Zoom, and we'll be able to ask Sean questions about his talk or about things that have come up in the course. Yep. So
thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, does anybody want to start us off?